Good afternoon, and welcome to a Zoom discussion with former Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives and Vice Presidential candidate, Mr. Paul Ryan. I'd like to offer thanks to all involved in this event, particularly Ambassador Rick Raber for arranging the talk. Today's event is sponsored by Franciscan University's newly formed Leadership Institute. I'm Dr. Daniel Kempton, Vice President for Academic Affairs and Professor of Political Science here at Franciscan University of Steubenville. I will begin today's program with a brief introduction of both my co-moderator, Father Dave Pivonka, TOR, and our guest, Speaker Paul Ryan. As most of you know, our president, Father Dave, has served as president of Franciscan University since 2019. Prior to that, Father Dave served in numerous roles at the university, including Vice President of Mission and Planning, the Director of Franciscan's Austrian Study Abroad program, and an adjunct professor. He was ordained a priest and a friar in May of 1996 and has served his order, the Third Order Regular Franciscans, in a variety of roles. Father Dave holds a Doctor of Education from the Graduate Theological Foundation and a JD from Purdue University Global. He recently published his 7th book and will now open us with a prayer.
So we begin all things at Franciscan University in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Heavenly Father, we thank you for Mr. Speaker joining us for this time. We thank you for his willingness and his generosity to spend time with us and our students. We ask you to bless our conversation, that we would come to understand you more fully, and that we encounter you in our dialogue. Lord, we pray for your blessing to come upon our country, that we would be more faithful to you and have a greater service to those around us. We make this prayer, Lord, in your name, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Thank you, Father. Our guest today, Speaker Paul Ryan, hails from the great state of Wisconsin, where he was born, raised, and schooled, and is now largely raising his own 3 children. He briefly left Wisconsin to attend Miami University in Oxford, Ohio, where he earned a bachelor's degree in economics and political science. In 1999, at the age of just 28, he was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives, representing Wisconsin's 1st District. In 2011, he became chair of the House Budget Committee, and in 2015, he chaired the House Ways and Means Committee, which I understand was his ideal position assignment. But later that year, he was elected the 54th Speaker of the House of the Representatives. I should also note a position he held until 2019. I should also note that Speaker Ryan also received an honorary doctorate from his alma mater and was later invited to receive a similar degree from Franciscan University of Steubenville. But at approximately the same time, he received another invitation from Governor Mitt Romney to serve as vice presidential candidate on the Republican ticket in 2012. Well, I guess one might consider that a higher order invitation. It is still a missed opportunity. I remain hopeful the university may someday rectify. In October of 2019, Speaker Ryan launched a nonprofit called the American Idea Foundation in Maryland. I would also be remiss not to note that Speaker Ryan is a member of St. John Vianney Catholic Church in Janesville, Wisconsin. He is a longstanding friend of Cardinal Timothy Dolan, who actually encouraged Speaker Ryan to accept the speakership. Speaker Ryan has been one of the few Republicans to address the intersection of conservative budget policy and Catholic social teaching. I now turn us over to Father Dave for the first question.
Well, first off, I too want to thank you so much for taking some time. I imagine your schedule is crazy, and on behalf of our students who are very grateful, so thank you so much. I had actually prepared some questions near the end to deal with the Bucks, the Brewers, and the Packers. So let's just delay that. If we have time, we'll certainly get to that.
All right. I'll make sure we do.
I'm sure you will. I'm sure you will. We'll see where this takes us. I had the opportunity to live in Washington, D.C. for 8 years. And when I was in seminary, I went to a debate that took place at Blessed Sacrament. At the time, Clinton was president, and Henry Cisneros was on his, I believe he's the Secretary of HUD, Chris Matthews, Bill Bennett, and there was a 4th individual that I can't recall. They all belonged to the same parish. a fascinating debate, and the debate was, what is it to be a Catholic in public policy? And you had four people that greatly disagreed on a number of issues. Later in the debate, Cisneros stated, he said, if I had to choose between my religion, my faith, and politics, I'm not sure which I would choose. To which Bill Bennett stated, and that's the problem. I would just be interested in your comment on that statement.
Bill Bennett's one of my mentors. I used to work for Bill Bennett, so he's a very close friend of mine. So put me in the Bill Bennett column on that one.
And how do we wrestle with that? How do we reconcile, or how have you personally reconciled your Catholic faith and politics and the craziness that we experience so oftentimes in that world?
Well, we have a compendium that's pretty handy, actually. If you look at my compendium, it's got lots of dog ears on it. The way I try to describe it to fellow Catholics in public life, and we had this Catholic dinner every third Thursday of the month at St. Peter's, which is the parish on Capitol Hill. A priest named Bill Burns, who's now a bishop up in Springfield, Massachusetts now, I think, conceived of this. And frankly, we all got together every third Thursday of the month and talked about these very issues as just fellow Catholics, Republicans and Democrats, over dinner at the rectory there with Father Bill. And a lot of us really dug deeply into these issues. The quick of it is, Father, is within the Catholic Church, you have prudential judgment, and you exercise that prudential judgment within the principles, but you've got to know where those principles lie. What the hierarchy of principles, the hierarchy of like life and things like that. There's a hierarchy of principles that you have to familiarize yourself with. Those are your guardrails. Those are the things that are inviolable. And then you exercise prudential judgment inside of that. And there's often a debate where that line lies. And different people have different opinions about where that line lies. Conservatives have our own view. For instance, life is inviolable. It's an irreducible primary principle that you cannot violate. Some other people don't see it that way, but wherever you draw that line on those principles that cannot be violated, then you exercise prudential judgment. I think budgets and programs and designs of welfare programs fall into that sort of prudential judgment category. But then you have things like family and life and children and things like that are just clear principles, Jersey-Berry guardrails you cannot violate. And that's kind of how I think most of us in public life approach it.
And I think that distinction is good, in that oftentimes we get criticized that may believe in the beauty and the dignity of human life, and we get criticized that we don't care for the poor. But I think in many ways those are policy questions, aren't they, Speaker? That one can debate and discuss that.
Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry, I didn't mean.
Yeah, well, just that one can debate on the best policy and the best manner with which we care for the poor. It's not to say that we don't have an obligation to care for the poor, but what's the best way?
That's exactly right. So it's a function of not if, it's a function of how best to do it. And so I see in that particular category three really important related principles that I get from the social magisterium. Preferential option for the poor, no brainer, yes, everyone agrees. Solidarity, no brainer, yes, everyone agrees. And subsidiarity, that is an area where you have to play.
You're doing great.
Yeah.
So in my mind, this is my own view, and this is more of a center-right view. They operate in harmony with one another. They operate in conjunction with another. They're tethered to one another. They should not be in conflict with one another. But I would argue that often policymakers sort of push subsidiarity aside and don't think that it belongs there or that it's really that relevant. In layman terms, the way I try to describe this concept to my non-Catholic friends in public life, it's like federalism. Mm-hmm. They know what that means. And it means government closest to the person governs best. People solving problems eye to eye, person to person, soul to soul is the best way to do it. The best way to realize the dignity of every human being, to realize the potential of every person, is to do it personally, is to make sure that your community, your civil society, your mediating institutions, your Rotary clubs and your parishes and just the Boy Scouts, whatever, They work to help people. And when you help a person, it makes you better, and you actually help that person. And a lot of times I would say, this is, granted, I'm a conservative. On the left, you push all of that aside and you think that, we can just do this with antiseptic government programs. I won't give you, I know we only have so much time, so I don't want to filibuster this, but the debate over the child tax credit right now is a perfect example of this debate. So the current majority, the Democrats, are trying to move this reconciliation bill, a bill I really have a big problem with, won't get into it, but they want to massively expand the child tax credit. That on itself sounds great. It sounds wonderful that, we want to help. And as a Catholic, you think, yes, I want more assistance to families having children because we want more of that. Yet they're designing this in such a way that, contrary to all of the evidence that we have had, a lot of it through Catholic social charities. I'm on the board at Leo and I teach at Notre Dame, where we spend a lot of time on this. Leo is a Notre Dame economics department thing. We know that a work requirement with aid and having a person help the poor through as a case manager is the best way to help a person get out of poverty. What this new proposal says is we're going to sever the tie between families and work and between families and case managers, a person to help them navigate through poverty, and just send them a check in the mail from the IRS. So we are now estranging poor families from the existing assistance safety net that they have, which involves a human being helping them get out of poverty, and the incentives that have proven to work extremely well, that work is a way out of poverty, that you want to, if you're able-bodied, work, especially for parents, especially to set examples for their kids and to put themselves on a pathway out of poverty. This new proposal is basically the IRS will put on your debit card or send you a check in the mail, cash assistance untethered to anything else, untethered to work, untethered to assistance, untethered to anything. And we believe, using prudential judgment and these Catholic social teaching principles, that that's going to do more damage. It's going to distance people from the aid that they should get and they can get and they have been getting. So that's enough. But I'm just saying, right now there's a big public policy debate where sort of Catholic left and Catholic right are fighting each other right now in public life.
Thank you, Speaker Ryan. This next question, I think, somewhat ties into your last answer. In your 2011 exchange of letters with Cardinal Dolan, you argued that the explosive growth of government spending and debt during the Obama years threatened an economic crisis and would eventually hurt the weakest by undermining the sustainability of government programs for the poor, and it could even lead to a collapse of individual support for charities. Having recently witnessed continued overspending, this time by a Republican administration, do you continue to see government overspending as a potentially threatening to the poor?
I do. It's actually one of the contributing factors to my choice of retirement, which was mostly family. But the last president made it really clear to me he did not want to engage in fiscal discipline. He did not want to engage, at least in his first term, if he had a second term, in doing what I thought was necessary to get our budgets under control. It wasn't popular, and there was no appetite for it. A lot of things you need to do are not necessarily popular, but they're necessary. So to the last point, yes, that's not a partisan thing. It's just a math and economics thing. And to your first point, what I meant when I said that, and Tim and I spoke about this a lot in those days. I think it was Bishop Blair and at a USCCB. I forgot the committee he chaired. They fired off a salvo at me on my budgets. Back in those days, I wrote the budgets for our government, and I wrote out of the House. I passed a budget about 8 years running to balance the budget and pay off the debt. And there are just necessary ways of doing that. You can't just cut defense and balance the budget, for example. And my point in this, and I'll be really brief, overspending means the government is making promises to the public it can't keep. And when that runs out, meaning when we lose our reserve currency status and our interest rates go up on us, which would happen eventually because of our profligate spending and our undisciplined spending, then the social safety net itself collapses and goes bankrupt. And the social chaos that would occur when the social contract, health and retirement security safety net for the poor, when that becomes unfundable, that is real crisis. And so the prudential thing to do is just know that that's coming, because it is, and know that you cannot keep borrowing like we are, because we can't, and know that if you put in really important prudent reforms now that maintain these missions, but do them in such a way that can reduce the debt load so that you can keep the promises going, is the smart thing to do. But that involves structural change of these programs, which disrupts the status quo. And those who like the status quo don't like that. But a stitch in time saves nine. If you put important programmatic reforms in place now that do not affect those in and near retirement, that I argue would make the safety net even better, but they would be worked differently, then you can avoid a debt crisis. You can avoid an entitlement collapse, because the least among us, they get hurt the first and the worst. And that has always been my premise, is currently my premise. And I work at the American Enterprise Institute as a fellow, and I'm working on a plan, an updated version of this plan for the 21st century, to rebuild the social safety net and reform our entitlement programs to fulfill the mission and avoid a debt crisis, so that we can keep this social contract going.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. One of the conversations we've had over the last many months at the university and with various constituents related to the university has been one about some of the executive orders that have come down recently, and concerns that it has on how it will deal with religious liberties in providing faith-based institutions continue to protect that. Two questions. Do you have a concern about that? And then what would be your advice to institutions and individuals who want to work towards maintaining and securing religious liberty and protecting that?
I have a great concern about this. When I was speaker, I fought then President Obama on this very much. I talked to him about this for hours, never got a good resolution, to the point where I invited the Little Sisters of the Poor to the State of the Union address, to sit in my box, to use them as my best lobbyists to try and advocate for a regulatory change. We got that regulatory change, but not with that president. We got it with the next president, with President Trump, on religious liberty protections. And Alex Azar over at HHS was extremely helpful in that as well. The problem with doing this on a regulatory basis through executive orders is it only lasts so long as the president lasts. That's the problem. We in the House passed legislation to protect religious liberty when I was there, but you need 60 votes in the Senate. This is something that can be filibustered and always will be. So we've never had the votes to get it into law. We had the votes out of the House, and we've done that. At least when we had the majority, we did that, but we could never get it out of the Senate. So two things going forward. Continue to press on administrations to keep these regulations in place, the ones that Trump put in place. I mean, Joe is a Catholic. I would like to think, I know him well, President Biden. I would like to think there would be, I got to be careful. I get a little casual sometimes. I would like to think there's a more willing audience there than, say, in the Obama administration. So I think that's priority one. Priority two is public education. And for students in places like Franciscan University to educate their lawmakers. Whose district is Steubenville in? I'm trying to think.
Johnson.
Oh,
Johnson.
yeah. Well, I mean, Bill's fine. I mean, I wouldn't worry about Bill's fine on that. But Sherry Brown. I'm sure Rob Portman's fine. Sherry Brown. I mean, meaning educate. What a lot of these folks think of, they think of the flash button cultural war issue at the moment, and the left goes left and the right goes right. But there's so much more to it than just that. And I think it really is a liberty issue. It's natural rights embodied in our Constitution as envisioned in the Declaration, which is really at jeopardy here. And I think there are discerning Democrats who can be persuaded on this. And that is what an institution like yours can contribute to, I think.
Thank you, Speaker. This is a little bit broader question. We've talked about religious liberty. We've talked about taxation policy, preference for the poor. But what are the other, from your perspective, what are the other political or cultural issues that you think we ought to be paying attention, that are high on your agenda? And are there leaders you're sort of following that you think are into or are professing some good solutions to those problems?
I think the social safety net has to be redesigned and rebuilt for the 21st century so that it's sustainable and so that it's work based on outcomes. And I think this current bill rolls back about 30 years of progress. What I mean when I say that is we've learned a lot through data and evidence what works and what doesn't work. And when LBJ launched the war on poverty, extremely well intended, but it was a 30-year war of $15 trillion spent, where we're doing about $1 trillion annually on 100 different programs just through the federal government. And 1% of those programs effectively are measured based on evidence and outcome. Success is basically measured on effort and input. How much money are we spending? How many programs are we creating? How many people are on these programs? Versus, are we getting people out of poverty? Is it working? What is the outcome? And invariably, when you dig into this issue, you will find faith is a really important component. And there's a lot of government that wants to purge that. And you find that incentives matter, work works, local control, human interaction is a really, really important ingredient. So subsidiarity in many instances. And that lesson's got to be learned, but we have new and fresh evidence. We have a new law that I wrote called the Evidence Act, which releases all this data so that academicians, Notre Dame does a lot of this. You could do this too, your econ department studies this and finds out what actually works. So we can leapfrog what I would argue is an ideological stalemate and just go to data and evidence. And invariably, the principles that we believe in, the full spectrum of Catholic social teaching, in my judgment, is validated by this evidence. And so I'd rather go to a data and evidence debate than an ideological impasse. And I think there's a real future for fixing the safety net and fixing servicing the poor. And I think we have breakout moments ahead of us, so long as we don't lapse back with some really bad policy decisions. Tim Scott, you want to name? I think Tim Scott gets this a lot. He's a senator from South Carolina. I think Ben Sass understands this really well. He's a senator from over in Nebraska. There's a multitude of House members who are into this issue. This is something that I tried cultivating young leaders to get involved in. I could go on with people's names, but going from ideology, which we just have impasses, to data and evidence, which, by the way, we have learned really buttresses our principles, is a good idea. And there's a moral high ground to be had and to maintain, and I think we should go get it.
Thank you. Many of the points you just alluded to are in the heart of Catholic social teaching, so that if an individual understands all these things, but my concern would be that if you raise this, it's going to be dismissed because you're religious, because you're Catholic, and we're not going to have that debate. So how do you kind of bring this in without turning people off necessarily because it's quote unquote Catholic social teaching?
I got that all the time thrown in my face. Like, you're just a Catholic, you're just being an ideologue. This is just your religion, your church. Get your separation from. I would get all that stuff on especially on life issues. I remember I refused to take out the defunding of Planned Parenthood in our reconciliation bill a few years back, and these were moderate Senate Republicans were accusing me of just being an ideologue. And so this life issue, especially public funding, Hyde Amendment, which now is controversial, it didn't used to be, that got thrown at me quite a bit. So I'll just use that as an example. And in committees, I had this argument all the time. And the way to present yourself is not through the lens of your faith or your religion in an ecumenical government format. You have to find better arguments using reason and science to make your case as well. So when it comes to life, I never use a religious argument, other than the fact that I believe in the dignity of human life. I believe in the worth of human life, and my values show me that, which you don't have to even be Christian to believe that. You don't even have to believe in God necessarily to believe that. But I use reason and science to make my case. You use science, which is, you can use all the ultrasound technology that's out there, all the genetic technology that we have out there, and the reason that comes from that, which is, if left undisturbed, it's a life full from inception on the way through to college and to retirement. You can make good, rational, science, fact-based arguments without having to resort to, I do this because of my church. That, to me, is how you expand converts. That is how, frankly, I convinced a bunch of, I would call pro-choice Republicans to vote with me on the Hyde Amendments, Planned Parenthood, on defunding abortion, because I could not appeal to these people on whatever church they went to. I could appeal to them based on reason, logic, and science. So I think it's important in the public sphere to equip yourselves with these additional arguments that you can make, because not everyone's going to agree with you on these other precepts.
Thank you. When I'm traveling a lot and spending a lot of time with just people across the country, there's honestly, Speaker, there's a sense of discouragement. People are discouraged, particularly people who have faith, who are fighting hard and trying to be faithful and trying to bring about change. How do you personally look at the landscape and not get discouraged?
I wish I had a really good answer for you. Yeah, I taught a class last semester, political polarization, in Catholic at Notre Dame. That's where I teach. Here's my biggest concern: is moral relativism is, I think, the basically irreducible core problem that we have in society today. And relativism has had a massive accelerant of digitization and technology. And so you take moral relativism, which was, percolating along on an upscale in the 20th century, and you throw digitization technology at it, where relativism can be monetized, where people can live in their silos and their echo chambers, and you have a serious problem on your hands. And the further secularization of America just adds to this. So we have a fire burning across the country, premised upon moral relativism and its offshoots like identity politics and the rest. And it's really, really challenging. So the best answer I have is two things. Number one, you've got to do everything you can to revive civil society, which are those mediating institutions between ourselves and our government, where we live our lives, where we can breathe life into institutions like churches and civic groups and the places where we understand right and wrong and truths and moral absolutes. And number two, people of faith have got to get out into the community. They have got to get out and rebuild these institutions. I'm a big supporter of homeschooling, but and with COVID and all the rest, but what you have are the very people in our communities that we need to be out in the communities, winning arguments, being on school boards, going to the PTAs or whatever, are just walling off, getting in the cul-de-sac and forming, pods with their other like-minded people, and just saying, and it's totally understandable. Our kids are in parochial schools. So it's just, I grew up in Catholic school. So it's really important that people of faith stay engaged in the broader community and engage in these arguments. And it's tempting not to.
Thank you, Speaker. Continuing on sort of your personal notion of how one balances things, you went into Congress at an incredibly young age. You went into the Speaker role at an incredibly young age. You had a young family. How do you, as part of your vocation, and what advice would you give to our students as they consider their future vocations, their career, their state in life, their responsibilities to their family, their local parish? How do you find the balance? What was your key in all of that?
Well, I retired because of it, frankly. It's funny. I got elected to Congress when I was 28, but that wasn't what I was thinking for my life. I wasn't planning that. I wanted to be an economist, and I thought my best job in life would be to be the chief economist at R.W. Baird in Milwaukee. So that's or an academic. So I took a detour, and I worked for Jack Kempton and Bill Bennett. And those men, I grew up with mentors in my life. Those men mentored me and taught me at an early age, public policy is a wonderful vocation. You can make an enormous difference in people's lives. And then at a young age, as a staffer out of college, I did well, and I learned you really can make a big difference in people's lives. And so I just got really taken with politics as a vocation. And that's what spurred me to move home, run for Congress when I was 27, hoping just to get the nomination. I ended up winning the whole thing. And then I did 20 years there. I retired. First of all, I didn't want to be speaker. I thought that was a good job for an empty nester. I wanted to be a Ways and Means chair. I thought the work-life family balance was maintainable there. But I don't know if you know the story real well, but Boehner was leaving and had no choice. He had to leave. The caucus turned on him, and there was no one else that had the votes to take the job but me. So Boehner calls Tim Dolan, because he knows I'm really good friends with Tim Dolan. This is the circle here I'm closing, and says, Ryan has got to take this job because no one else has the votes. He's got to do this. I know you were his bishop. He was the bishop of Milwaukee for many years before he went to New York. I know you're close with him. Can you help me with him? So Tim Dolan calls me and just pours buckets of Catholic guilt on me. I mean, just lays it out. To which I called Boehner. I'm like, you.
Careful.
So my wife and I and my brother and sister-in-law spent a weekend praying, thinking, and our priest, frankly, he's still our priest at St. John's, thought about it, prayed about it. And, I just basically decided to do it. And I knew then in my mind, I'll do this for 2 terms because I know this job is such a time suck. It puts you on the road 6 days a week, basically. And I had a condition to be home on weekends, but I learned I was neglecting my district with that rule, because every weekday I was outside of Wisconsin, and I felt guilty for neglecting my own congressional district. So I spent all my Saturdays in my congressional district. And so I only had Sundays with my family, and my kids were entering and moving through high school. And if I did another term, I would have lost all those years. So I retired so that I could spend at least the tail end of my kids' high school years being the dad and husband I aspired to be, that I knew I could not be as speaker. So that is basically why I retired. That's why I knew going into this is really an empty nester's job. But I took it because I frankly felt a duty to do it. But in my mind, I thought 2 terms and that's it. And that's exactly what I concluded as I got into the job. So and that's why I retired, basically.
And we're glad you were in that job. You mentioned just a moment ago not to live in a cul-de-sac and kind of hide. And we at the university, that's what we speak about all the time is St. Francis, here's the Lord, say to him, rebuild my church, which is falling. So this going out, this engaging to do it with truth and with charity and humility is what we're about at the university. So as we close, I would love to offer an invitation whenever you'd like to come and teach. I've heard of that school that you mentioned a couple of times. But you are certainly welcome here at Franciscan University. So the last thing I would like to offer is 2022, which will be an important year. Will the Bucks repeat, and what's going to happen in the election in 22? Where do you see that going?
Well, if you watch this, the opener on Wednesday, they destroyed the Brooklyn
Nets. Yeah,
the Nets. I mean, they just like by 22 points, I think it was. So. And the Bucks they just reloaded with new talent. So I think the Bucks will. I think the Packers will finally get past the NFC Championship.
Oh.
I don't know if you're Bengal over there. You guys are Browns fans, right? Steubenville is Browns.
No. Steelers. Careful. We won't go there. You're doing fine. You're doing fine.
Them too. So we beat the Bengals and the Steelers so far this year. The Steelers, we think, are like the AFC version of the Packers. That's kind of how we always think of the Steelers. And then what was your last point, Father?
What do you think the election in 22? What do you think that's going to look like?
I feel pretty bullish on us taking the House in the midterms. The Senate's a little harder nut to crack. It's going to come down to Ohio, which I feel better about than Wisconsin. Wisconsin's harder statewide to win than Ohio. Pennsylvania is really hard. So we have to take I hate to say it, but we have to have Ohio or else we can't get the Senate majority. Pennsylvania and Wisconsin are going to be harder nuts to crack. So in Georgia's, I think we should get that. So the Senate's a harder one to predict. The House, I feel pretty safe in predicting we'll get the majority. And either way, I believe we'll then have divided government.
Okay. Again, thank you so much for your time. Be assured of our prayers for you, your wife, and your kids. Thank you for your service to the country, and to be able to do it with such dignity and grace, we're greatly appreciative.
Thank you so much. God bless. Nice to be with you today.